Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. And in today's video, I'm doing a personal review. This is a pedal that is not sponsored by Sonicake. I bought this pedal with my own money, and I bought it because I have a lot of guitar pedals, and this looks like a really good solution to use some guitar pedals with bass guitar. So this is the Portal pedal from Sonicake, and this is an effects loop mixing pedal, and it actually has two different modes, which opens up a lot of routing possibilities that you didn't have before with just your standard series effects loops found on most guitar and bass amplifiers. Now, for most bass players, a pedal like this is going to be a little bit of a challenge to set up for the first time, and you have to kind of think about how your signal chain is. But if we're using a very simple example, this essentially takes your effects loop in your bass amplifier or even at the front of the input of the amplifier, and it converts it from a single effects loop into two. You can punch in a bunch of different effects on loop A, and then we have a bunch of other different effects on loop B for a different sound, and we can punch those in with the foot switches as needed. We even have individual volume controls for each loop in order to balance the signal out so that the volume is consistent when you swap between the two. Very nice and handy. And then you can also just have a dry signal going through this pedal as well. This is a buffered input and output when C is engaged. If you don't have any of these connected, now you just have a true bypass. Now, when we get into more complex routing, most bass players are going to see this as black magic, but now we switch this over to parallel, and now these effects loops are going to operate a little bit differently. Now we still have our dry signal here, but now we can take that dry signal and whatever is in these effects loops, if we wanted to say put in a guitar distortion, which I have one off to the side here that we'll use later on in the video for some audio examples. And a guitar pedal, for example, is not going to be able to reproduce bass frequencies at all, or not very well, because there are intentional designs inside those pedals to eliminate the ultra low frequencies, because a guitar amplifier really can't produce those. But if you like the character and sound of that guitar distortion pedal, for example, and you want to use it with bass guitar, now what you can do is mix in that particular loop with that guitar distortion with your individual volume control while still retaining the ultra low frequencies of your dry signal. That opens up a lot of opportunities and new sonic capabilities of the guitar pedals and the different effects pedals that you use with bass that were not really meant for bass to begin with. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more technical about these volume controls. So these volume controls, if you look at C, this position about 2 o'clock is actually referred to as unity gain. It is not at 12 o'clock is what you would assume, most people anyway. This means that whatever is coming into the input here is exactly what's going out on the output. It's not boosting the signal, it's not reducing the signal. So that is the setting that you need to keep that in mind. These volume controls are operating in a very similar manner. What's important to understand that these volume controls attenuate the signal going to the returns here, coming back in. So the return means that it's accepting a signal back in from your pedal chains back into the pedal. And these volume controls adjust that. The sends, whatever is coming in from the input, that signal and that volume is exactly on send A and send B. Now, that is important to understand as well, because when we have this pedal set to parallel, that gives you some more options that you can work with. Now, if I have a one input and the send A and the B and then the actual output here, the main output, now I have three buffered outputs that I can send to three separate locations that I can use, and I can drive a cable up to 20 feet or so before I start losing signal, for example. That really gives me some tonal options and some routing options that I didn't have before. You also can do the opposite, which you can take three individual inputs and then sum them up to a single output here. And what we can use that for is, say, for example, we have three bass guitars, so we need a Music Man for one song, and then a Precision for others, and then a Jazz for the rest of them, for example. I can plug each one of those basses in, so into the main input, return A and return B, and now we have individual volume controls here. to adjust each of those bases so that they're all the same signal level, so that the output, when it goes to the input of your amplifier, for example, you don't have to go and fiddle with the settings on your amplifier. You just punch them in as you need, and you can get the signal exactly the way you want to, and you're good to go. These switches on the side, these are the phase inversion switches for loops A and B. And all that basically means, in simplest terms, if I press this switch, so if I have a voltage going into this input side here and it's going positive, then on the output side it's going to go negative. It's basically doing this. If most of the time you're going to have signals that whatever's going on the input, if it's positive, then it's going to be positive on the output. You hit the switch and now it's doing this. And that's important because there are pedals that are by design or even by accident out of phase doing this, and that is not always the best situation, because if you're trying to, especially in parallel mode, if you try to go and mix your original signal and say your effects is doing this, it's actually canceling out frequencies and canceling out noise to the point where you actually get no sound at all, or you lose a lot of signal. So these switches here are meant to fix that if you run into that problem. So hopefully my animation of my fingers here. So this is how most signals should be going from input to output. But if you have an issue with the pedal that's doing this, where one's going positive, one's going negative, then you push this switch to get them to do this again. I hope that helps. Now over here on the connectivity of the pedal, we have two DC 9-volt ports. Now they can either be an input or an output. This pedal takes about 97 milliamps to run, and then it's just another convenience if you have that second port to run over to a distortion pedal or another set of effects pedals. I don't see any limitation on the power, but if you're running up to 500 milliamps, for example, which I have this plugged into a 500 milliamp power port, I don't see that being an issue at all. Now, the other problem that I am seeing here, and this is probably the only thing that I have an issue with this pedal, is that this pedal, where these jacks are located, so here's your output, here's your input, and then you have your send and return for your two effects loops. But if you, for example, have your patch cords that look like this, for example, you're not going to be able to plug them in here because then they're going to be too wide. These jacks are a little too close together for these kinds of patch cords, so just be aware. That's my only gripe about this pedal, is that you're kind of forced to use straight angled standard 1/4 inch cables in order to interface with it, or use very low profile ones in order to connect to it. 90-degree ones, for example, are probably not going to fit here just because of how they're oriented. But just be aware, when you're trying to put together your pedal board, for example, that has to be a consideration. The last technical note I wanted to mention before we get into the audio demos here is these volume knobs. These volume knobs, while these are set to unity gain here about 2 o'clock, so the signal coming in is not being boosted or cut in any way, but you don't really have a lot of travel here in terms of wanting to boost an incoming signal, and you really shouldn't be boosting incoming signals with this pedal. If anything, you should be reducing signal to match whatever your weakest input is. For example, if I have a passive bass here that doesn't have a lot of signal, I'm going to leave that at unity gain. I might try to boost it a little bit, but then that's going to introduce a little bit more noise than I maybe want. If I have an active bass with a really, really hot signal, for example, on this channel, for example, I'm going to bring that signal down so that the passive bass and the active bass are equal volume. And that is the way that I would go and use those volume knobs. It's not really meant for boost. You do have a little bit of that, but it is not the main feature, I would say. So just keep that in mind. All right, so here's the setup. I'm going to interface the camera with the Behringer XR18. I'm actually going to have the RTA on the screen here that you can see. We have the Brutus Distortion Overdrive DCP-02 from K-Line running into the Tiger Shark DCP-09, but I'm only using the gate because that will tame some of the noise that inevitably comes from distortions and overdrives. That's going to go into the Sonicake here on the A loop. I'm going to play just the clean signal first. I put a little bit of reverb just to put the signal in a space. It's going through the Mini Mega back through into the Behringer. We have ourselves a modest EQ of how I would set it, how I think it would sound, and I'm using a GSR 200 with flats, and I'll have both pickups on full with the tone all the way up. And let's see how this sounds. Well, everyone, I hope this video has been helpful, and I'm very happy with the purchase of this Sonic Portal. And there's definitely going to be a lot more experimentation going on, but hopefully some of the technical aspects and some step-by-step instructions on how I would go about using this will be beneficial to how a bass player would use this. And there's just so many different applications for a pedal like this. If there's any questions, please let me know. Thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel. I'll see you guys on the next one.